gamers, this is Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I am so excited to be bringing you this video because I have been working with Chip Theory Games to create a Gearloc guide. Those of you who have been interested in playing Too Many Bones, but you want more details about how each Gearloc works, well, you're in luck, because this is the series for you. If you're interested in Too Many Bones, but you don't know a lot about it, one of its biggest selling points is that the game is chock full of interesting Gearlocs to play. Gearlocs are your characters in the game, and every one of them has a different playstyle, different dice, different stats, different everything that can make it feel like you're playing a whole new game every single time you come to Too Many Bones. With that variability, there comes a little bit of a learning curve because each Gearloc truly is different. However, this video is actually about the things that Gearlocs have in common. This is our Gearloc anatomy video. If you know nothing about Too Many Bones and you want to learn about Gearlocs, I'd watch this one first and then move forward in the series to whichever Gearloc it is you want to play. I'm using Patches as our example because I'm about to film our first video about him, but the things I'm going to tell you in this particular segment are applicable to any and all Gearlocs. Hopefully this video is going to be the foundation that helps prep you for all of the awesome Gearloc fun to come. To get ready to play your Gearloc, you're going to need 4 things. The first is your Gearloc Mat. It's going to have your Gearloc's name on it and spaces for their dice. We're going to get into specifics about each and every single one in this series, fear not, but you need the mat. You also need your Gearloc chip. So every Gearloc is going to have a chip that has their image on it. It will match the image on the mat. You need your Gearloc's reference sheet, which will again have their picture and their name on it. And we're going to go over all the amazing information this gives you as you're learning how to play into your Gearloc, or just referring back while playing one you already know. And you also need your Gearloc's dice. Every single Gearloc is going to have a set of 16 dice, an initiative die, and 4 stat dice, which we are about to talk about. You'll again notice that all of the Gearloc's components will share some things in common. The mat, the Gearloc chip, and the Gearloc dice will all match in color, so it's easier to match your Gearlocs up. You'll have names and portraits on all of the components you need. And if you want to check to make sure that you have the right Gearloc dice, the color, then you can also look for your character's initiative die, which will have their picture on it. So here we have a lovely image of Patches. There's so much to cover for every Gearloc, but because Too Many Bones is a dice builder RPG, I figured it'd be best for us to start with the dice. As I mentioned before, every Gearloc is going to have an initiative die. It's going to be a bunch of faces with a number and their face on it. It's also what you're going to roll to figure out where in the turn order you're going to go when you start a fight. These 4 dice are your stat dice. These are going to tell you your Gearloc's health, dexterity, attack, and defense. And I'm going to show you exactly where that appears on their Gearloc mat. Every single Gearloc is going to have these 5 dice in their color. And every Gearloc is going to have 16 skill dice that you're going to be training up and rolling throughout a game of Too Many Bones. And it's these dice that help make your Gearloc experience truly different every single time you come back and play with somebody new. What's on the actual die faces is going to be something that I leave for the upcoming Gearloc guide for each Gearloc, but I think it's important to take a look at these for a moment because what makes them very convenient, despite the fact that they all look very different, is that they actually are numbered 1 through 16. And these numbers are going to correspond to slots on their Gearloc mat. So you never have to worry that you have the wrong die because die number 1 is labeled as die number 1 right there in the top left corner. And this number will appear on all faces of the die, so you definitely know which one you're rolling and what you're working with. As for what the faces do and other information about your Gearloc, all of that is going to be on the Gearloc reference sheet, which I'm going to show you now so that you know how to study up and get ready to play your Gearloc. So here is Patch's reference sheet. Every Gearloc has one and it's going to have the same structure, but the sheet will contain unique information depending on the Gearloc that you're playing. At the top, you just have the basics. You have your Gearloc's image, their name, and a convenient difficulty meter. This goes from 1 to 4, and this is telling you here that Patches is very beginner friendly, co-op at only 1 dot. And he's only a little bit more complicated in solo. So one of the reasons that we're covering him first is that he's a very beginner friendly Gearloc, and if you're looking to start with someone, he's a great choice. When you saw Patch's die tray, you saw all of those glorious die faces and might have thought, wow, look at all these options. How will I ever know what they are? Well, the good news is that the Gearloc reference sheet is here for you. Every single Gearloc will have multiple professions, or basically skill trees, on their Gearloc mat, and the reference sheet handily divides those professions up for you so you can see which dice you can train and what die faces are available. There are also nifty shorthands on here that are going to correspond with what's on the Gearloc mat. So for example, a star means that that is a starter skill, and there are no prerequisites to train it, while there are prereqs for others without the star. Because every Gearloc is different, you'll also get differing information on them. For example, while a star marks where a profession's training begins, you may also see a circle on your reference sheet. So this is boomers, because a circle means that you start with these dice on your Gearloc mat. So paying attention to this part of the Gearloc reference sheet is going to give you visual keys that tell you very important information about your Gearloc. So here are all of Patch's die faces, and they look amazing. But what do they mean? You're going to be able to answer that question by looking right to the left at the dice icon key. The key will again differ for each Gearloc, but all the symbols that are on those Gearloc dice are going to show up along the left-hand side with an explanation of what they are. The other thing I really like about this key is that it gives you information about exactly when and how a die can be played for your Gearloc. So once you've rolled a die, that doesn't mean that its effect happens immediately. They're dice that you can store for later, or dice that have to be placed in certain spots on your Gearloc mat. And the dice icon key gives you some of that information. So after each of these skills, there is a letter or set of letters. For example, heal has an I after it, or recover down here has an A or a double A after it. The way you're going to interpret those abbreviations is to look here in this abbreviation key at the bottom right of your Gearloc reference sheet. When you use this in conjunction with your dice icon key, you're going to know exactly when and how these dice are allowed to be used, and that's going to help you figure out how to strategize with them and make plans for bringing these amazing skills into your game. So the front of the Gearloc's reference sheet is all about the dice. You're going to know exactly what faces are available to you on each die and which dice have which faces. You're going to get a key that tells you what all the die faces mean, and you're going to have an abbreviation key that helps you further interpret the information in the dice icon key. Now we're going to flip this over to the back and see what other riches it has in store for us. There's a lot. All right, so now we are on the back of Patch's Gearloc reference sheet. And once again, there's crucial information on here that you do not want to miss. Up here in the top left, you have a backup plan breakdown. Too Many Bones is named after these bones die faces that you roll, and they represent a failure in the moment, but you can place them in your backup plan to have something really cool happen once per turn in battle. Every Gearloc has a different backup plan, and this one is Patch's. So here you have details for what happens when you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 bones in your backup plan and want to spend them. 6 is the max that you can do anything with. Here you're going to get critical details about the character. So for Patch's, this section describes the difference between his heals and buffs, how to revive people, and how to use some of his special consumable items. But this is going to be different for each Gearloc, and some of them are much more complicated, and you'll have more extensive explanations here. Over here on the right, we're going to start with the beginner build strat. If you've never played a Gearloc before and you just need a little bit of guidance, Chip Theory has provided it, and it's right here. So if you are spending training points and you don't know exactly how, look here for advice. It is very good advice. Trust me, I've followed it many times playing this game. Here we have information about your innate ability and your innate +1. Every Gearloc has an innate ability that gives them some sort of cool power, and the 6 on their backup plan is always upgraded to innate +1. This is where you're going to go for specific information about their innate ability. And also, fun fact, when your Gearloc upgrades from innate to innate +1, you're going to flip their chip and you'll see them surrounded with stars. So that's how you remind yourself that your character has leveled up. And then down here, you're going to have effect dice definitions. Every single Gearloc has a different set of dice, so you're going to get a different set of definitions per Gearloc, but these are going to be specific to what you need to know for the one you're playing. So while the front of the sheet detailed the die faces and what they do, the back of your Gearloc reference sheet is going to be more text heavy. You're going to learn about your backup plan, you're going to learn about critical details, how to build your character, an explanation of their innate and innate +1 abilities, and any special definitions you need to know beyond what is on the dice icon key. So now that we have looked at the reference sheet and at the dice, it's time to move on to the Gearloc Mat, which is where all the magic happens. All right, so now it's time to bring everything together. We've covered the dice, at least in a basic sense. We've talked about the Gearloc reference sheet, and here we have Patch's Gearloc Mat. Once again, Patches will have his own unique traits and skills. His mat looks different from any other Gearlocs, but every Gearloc mat also has things in common that remain the same across all Gearlocs, and that's what I'm going to be explaining to you in this video, so that any Gearloc you pick up, you at least have a starting sense of what to do with them and where stuff goes. Every Gearloc mat is going to have the same top left corner where you have the Gearloc's name, a little rundown of their professions, their stats, which we're going to talk about in depth momentarily, their innate and innate +1 abilities, and information about how they do combat. So whether someone is melee or ranged or a combo is going to be noted right here on their Gearloc mat. All Gearlocs also have the same basic stats, and those are health, dexterity, attack, and defense. So when you get training points in Too Many Bones, you can choose to train either one of your skill dice, which we'll go over here, or you can train one of your stats. And that's going to be a really common choice for you because these need to be bumped up in order to use those skill dice to the max. So we're going to be talking about these basic stats that every Gearloc shares. The first one is health. Right now, Patch's health is 5, so if I was going to put him into a battle right now, he would have 5 health chips underneath his main character chip. If he were injured in battle, he would lose health chips. You can hear that nice clink. You can see why Chip Theory Games is called Chip Theory Games. And if he loses all of his health chips, then he's KO'd. He's knocked out. So one of your training point options when you have one is always to increase your health. You're going to need to put training points elsewhere in order to actually be viable in battle, but bumping your health is never a bad idea, and you always have the option to do that. Another smart place to spend training points is in your dexterity stat. Dexterity doesn't always sound as exciting as health, attack, or defense, but you absolutely need dex in a game of Too Many Bones. The reason for that is that you use dex to pay for everything else you do. If you want to move, guess what? That costs dex. If you wanted to roll an attack die, cost you dex. Defense die, cost dex. All these skill dice, they also have a dexterity cost. So it's another stat that you might want to put training points into until you have given yourself enough to have options every single turn of battle. So when you have a training point, health and dexterity can just be bumped up no matter what. You always have that option. So if I wanted to put a training point into my dex and raise it by 1, I would just put one of those stat dice we talked about earlier here. So the stat dice act as counters to show you how high your health, dex, attack, and defense are. However, your attack and defense stats are a little bit different. They do not automatically bump up when you put a training point in just because you want them to. You actually have to roll to increase your attack and your defense. So right now, Patches has an attack of 1. That means that when he wants to attack, he can only roll 1 attack die, and that's his entire attack for the turn. There's other cool stuff that he could do depending on what dice you have, but you might want to raise that at some point. However, if you want to put a training point into attack, you have to roll the number of attack dice you currently have and hope that you don't roll any bones. So for example, with attack 1, I'm going to take 1 attack die and I'm going to roll it. Okay, so this would count as a success. I have an attack face. I would be able, if I was putting a training point in, to spend it on increasing Patch's attack. However, if I got unlucky rolling his attack dice and I rolled a bones face, I would still get to keep my training point. It's not that it disappears into the ether or anything, but I can't increase his attack. I would have to put it somewhere else. That also means that increasing your attack and defense stats gets harder the higher they are. So at 1 attack, Patches only has to roll 1 attack die to check to see if the training is successful. If I've been successful before, then we would roll 2 attack dice and hope not to get that bones face that would prevent us from increasing it again.
Training defense is almost the same as training attack, but defense dice have 1 extra bones face. So to compensate for that, the first time you roll bones, you do get 1 reroll.
So these are the basic Gearloc stats that you'll always be working with, and every Gearloc's got them. Every Gearloc is also going to have some combination of active and locked die slots. The number of slots may change, but you'll always have some room for active dice and some room for locked dice. If you're wondering what the difference is, well, I'm about to tell you, so you're in luck. If you look at your Gearloc reference sheet, dice that have an A next to them are going to be active slot dice, and that's how you use them. So if you have an active slot die, what that means is that you roll it during battle, and then you slot it up here until you use it or until the battle ends. So the die will disappear at the end of battle if you never use it. So one type of active die that you're going to be working with immediately, even if you train no skills, is your defense die. So let's say that Patches on his turn wants to roll some defense. and he rolls this 2, you don't use it right away. You got to wait for somebody to hit you in order for you to defend. So what Patches would do is he would put it in his active slot and then wait for an enemy to hit him and use it from his active slot. So a lot of dice that you'll roll in this game can be used that way. And some of your dice can even be placed in the active slots of other Gearlocs if you're playing co-op. You may also be working with locked dice. Locked dice are very interesting because they are more persistent than active dice. If you roll a die and lock it, then it stays up here until either 1, you use it, or 2, you get knocked out. Some Gearlocs have locked dice that stay in place throughout an entire game of Too Many Bones, while other locked dice allow you to just save something good for later, even if that later means 2 or 3 battles from now, or during recovery or lock picking. The other thing that all Gearlocs are going to have is a backup plan. This game is called Too Many Bones because you roll bones, and in the moment they represent a failure. However, they don't have to stay that way. Some of the bones you roll can be placed into your backup plan. When you roll bones, you can choose to put them in your backup plan, and the more bones are in your backup plan, the more options you have. Once per turn, you can spend any number of the bones in your backup plan to do one of the unique abilities that's available to your character. Patches has his own unique backup plan, as does every other Gearloc, but everybody's got one, and the other thing to note is that everybody will switch their innate +1 ability when they have 6 bones and spend them out of their backup plan. You'll note that there are only 5 slots here. You can only restore 5 bones. If you get a 6th one, you can expend all of the bones, including that 6 that's in the sort of holdover to get your innate +1. And no, you can't store extras, even if your rolls are as bad as mine. My other pro tip for your backup plan is that most of the time when you roll bones, putting them in your backup plan is optional. There are some die faces that require it, but we'll get to those in the specific Gearloc guides. If you roll a bones on an attack or a defense die, you might as well, because if I rolled 1 attack die and got a bone and I put it up here, I would still get to roll 1 attack die next turn from the attack dice pool. However, if you put a skill die up here in your backup plan, when you use that die in your backup plan, it exhausts and you don't get to use the skill. So if you roll a skill, roll a bone, but you'd rather try to roll that skill again on another turn, you might choose not to put it in your backup plan. Just be careful what you're putting up here, because it's awesome when you spend your backup plan dice to do something cool, but it also is not awesome when you really wanted to roll skill die that's stuck up here. And now we're in the part of the mat that contains the professions. Every Gearloc has a set of them. Every Gearloc has different professions. So you're going to spend a lot of your time each game exploring and figuring out the possibilities here. The basic things to know are that professions are connected by lines on the mat that are the same color. So all of the red lines are connected to this combat medic profession. These 2 skills are connected by this green line. You have some blue. And then yellow always denotes consumables. So every Gearloc will have professions they can train in with training points, and they're also going to have consumables that they can pick up through loot or through the backup plan sometimes. Pickett has a fortunate discovery ability that lets him do that. When a skill in one of the professions has a star on it, that means it's a starting skill and you don't need any prerequisites to train it. So for the combat medic profession for Patches, he can train medkit just for starters, but he couldn't start over here with medpack. You have to do medkit first and then follow the arrows to the other abilities within the profession. This profession has 2 skills with stars on it, so you can just pick whichever one you want to start with first. And then this stim stacker profession, again, has a star here, so you would train stim kit first, and then you can move in various directions following the arrows. When you're doing setup at the beginning of a game, don't forget to also check your Gearloc reference sheet for any skills that have a circle around them. Patches doesn't have any of those, but if the skill has a circle around the bullet point on your Gearloc reference sheet, what that means is that you start with that die on your Gearloc mat already, and you don't have to spend any training points to get it. It's just automatic. Your Gearloc mat will also give you some suggestions for how to organize your play space. So loot over here is where you can keep loot cards. There are also some little visual helpers along the side to help you keep track when you are unlocking loot, because some of your loot will have multiple locks on it that you'll have to pick across several turns. Over here is where you put your exhausted dice. So if you use a skill die, unless it has some sort of special ability that prevents this, it will become exhausted afterwards and unavailable to you until the next battle. You can't just keep rolling your same skill dice again and again and again. So your exhausted dice are kept here to mark that you have already exhausted them on a given battle. And then the last part of your Gearloc mat looks decorative, but it's actually quite useful. This right here is the prep area. There will be various instructions in the game that refer to your prep area, and it's just the spot on your Gearloc mat where the art is for your character. The prep area is where you put things like buff HP, a bot if you're playing with the Gearloc who builds bots, or any number of other things that are going to be unique to each Gearloc. But when the prep area is mentioned, this is it. So that concludes our Gearloc anatomy overview. Once again, every Gearloc is going to have dice, a Gearloc reference sheet, a chip, and a Gearloc mat for you to explore. Hopefully this gives you a sense of how to start learning each new Gearloc you get. It'll give you a touch point every time you try somebody new, because there will be something familiar about them. From this point on, we're going to be moving into specific Gearloc guides, and I'm so excited about that. We'll be starting with Patches because he is such an intro-friendly character, and he makes a great intro to a series. So this was the general video, but if you want to learn more about a specific Gearloc, you'll be able to skip ahead to them and get down into the details. Thank you so much for watching, and happy gaming.